place is New York City, and this is the eve of the end. Because even at midnight, it's high noon, the hottest day in history, and you're about to spend it in the Twilight Zone.
The air in the attic is thick with more than just dust. It's heavy with the stench of a war that refused to end in 1945. Two men stand eye to eye, separated by a generation, but bound by a single cursed samurai sword. One holds a secret that could shatter a nation's history. The other holds a grudge that fuels a lethal fire. Before the credits roll, a truth is spoken that would erase this footage from television for 50 years. This is one episode from Twilight Zone banned for a reasonable cause. Season 5, Episode 31. The door clicks shut, the handle vanishes, and suddenly, two men are trapped in a space that feels less like a room and more like a pressure cooker. This is the setup for The Encounter, an episode that didn't just push the boundaries of 60s television, it jumped over them and landed in a minefield. It's a two-man play, a claustrophobic character study that pits Fenton, a disillusioned World War II veteran played by Neville Brand, against Arthur Takamori, a young Japanese-American gardener played by a then-fledgling George Takei. The atmosphere is immediately suffocating. Fenton is a man drowning in beer and regret, living in a house that feels like a monument to his own failures. He invites Takamori up to his attic under the guise of offering him a job, but it's clear from the first frame that Fenton isn't looking for a gardener. He's looking for a ghost to fight. He's searching for a way to validate the hollow shell of a man he has become. In the corner of the room sits a samurai sword, a trophy Fenton brought back from the Pacific Theater. This isn't just a prop, it is the third character. The sword supposedly has an inscription that claims it can only be wielded by a man of honor, and as the episode progresses, it begins to exert a supernatural pull on both men, acting as a lightning rod for the racial animosity and post-traumatic stress simmering beneath the surface. The dialogue starts as a series of awkward jabs. Fenton, fueled by alcohol, begins to lean into the casual, systemic racism of the era. He speaks to Takamori not as a neighbor or a fellow citizen, but as a representative of the enemy he fought decades prior. Neville Brand plays Fenton with a terrifying, sweat-soaked intensity. You can see the gears of his mind grinding under the weight of his own guilt. He's a man who needs someone to blame for his stagnant life. And Takamori is the perfect target. On the other side, George Takei delivers a performance that is uncharacteristically grounded and somber compared to his later, more flamboyant roles. His Takamori is a man trying to outrun his heritage, trying to be just an American, yet he is constantly pulled back into the shadow of a war he was barely old enough to remember. As the heat in the attic rises, literally and figuratively, the supernatural element of the Twilight Zone begins to bleed through. The door won't budge. The temperature climbs to an unbearable degree. The two men are forced into a psychological nakedness that most television of the 60s wouldn't dare touch. They begin to trade war stories, but these aren't the heroic tales found in the propaganda films of the time. These are the ugly, jagged shards of truth. Fenton confesses to the cold-blooded murder of a Japanese soldier who was trying to surrender, the very man who owned the sword. This revelation strips away the heroic veteran archetype and replaces it with a man haunted by a war crime. It suggests that the good war had very dark corners, a sentiment that was incredibly jarring for a 1964 audience still clinging to a very sanitized version of World War II history. But the true explosion, the moment that sealed the episode's fate, comes from Takamori. In a moment of high-tension vulnerability, he reveals the source of his own self-loathing. He tells Fenton that his father wasn't a victim of the war, but a collaborator. He claims his father stood on the shores of Hawaii and signaled the Japanese planes with a mirror, directing them toward the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. This was the good reason the critics and the public turned on the episode. It wasn't just a plot twist, it was a cultural hand grenade. Takamori is paralyzed by a traitor's blood narrative. He believes he is inherently flawed because of his father's supposed actions. This internal conflict turns the attic into a courtroom where both men are the defendant and the judge. The sword acts as the executioner. When Takamori finally picks up the blade, the haunting reaches its crescendo. The sword seems to possess him, Or perhaps it simply gives him the permission he's been looking for to stop being polite and start being the monster Fenton expects him to be. The brilliance of the writing here, handled by Martin Goldsmith, is how it uses the sci-fi/supernatural veneer to discuss things that were strictly taboo. In 1964, America was in the thick of the civil rights movement, and the wounds of World War were still very much open. By trapping a white veteran and a Japanese American in a room, Serling and Goldsmith were forcing the audience to look at the racial elephant in the room. They were suggesting that the war hadn't ended. It had just moved into our attics, our basements, and our subconscious. The episode suggests that hate is a self-perpetuating cycle, a cursed sword that passes from hand to hand until someone is brave enough to drop it. The ending of the episode is bleak, even by Twilight Zone standards. There is no moralizing narrator to wrap things up with a neat bow. Instead, there is a violent, inevitable conclusion that leaves both characters destroyed. When Takamori finally lunges with the sword, shouting, "Banzai!" it's a moment of total character collapse. He has succumbed to the stereotype, and Fenton has finally found the enemy he needed to justify his own brokenness. It's a tragic, circular ending that implies that as long as we carry the weapons of the past, we are doomed to repeat its slaughters. The sheer grit of this episode is what makes it stand out in the 5th season. While other episodes were leaning into more whimsical or heavy-handed sci-fi tropes, the encounter felt like a punch to the gut. It used the anthology format to stage a gritty, realistic thriller that just happened to have a locked door and a haunted sword. The performances are so visceral that you can almost feel the humidity and the smell of stale beer coming off the screen. It is a masterclass in tension building, using limited space to create an expansive psychological landscape. However, the very things that make it a masterpiece of tension are what made it a pariah of broadcasting. The episode didn't just depict racism, it depicted a very specific, very sensitive historical lie that the Japanese-American community had been fighting against since the 40s. By giving Takamori that specific backstory, the writers inadvertently reinforced the exact justification used for the mass internment of 120,000 innocent people. They took a real-world trauma and used it as a spooky plot point, and that is where the artistic merit crashed headfirst into social reality. Watching the encounter today is a surreal experience. You are watching a piece of lost history, a window into what creators thought they could get away with and where the line was finally drawn. It remains a testament to the power of the series that even its failures or banned entries are more intellectually stimulating and emotionally taxing than the successes of other shows. It is a dark, uncomfortable, and brilliantly acted piece of television that proves the most dangerous monsters in the Twilight Zone weren't the aliens or the robots. They were the things we carried home with us from the war and locked away in the attic. But why did this specific lie about a father's betrayal cause a silence that lasted 50 years? The erasure. The silence wasn't accidental, it was a calculated disappearance. Usually, when a television episode is pulled, it's due to a temporary lapse in taste or a tragic real-world event that mirrors the fiction too closely. But with The Encounter, the erasure was systematic. Following its single broadcast on April 1st, 1964, the episode didn't just go into the vault, it effectively ceased to exist in the public consciousness. This wasn't a case of a network being oversensitive. It was a response to a community that had finally found its voice after decades of being forced into the shadows of American history. The primary catalyst for the ban was the Japanese American Citizens League, JIACL. For them, the episode wasn't just a piece of horrifying fiction. It was a dangerous revival of the fifth column myth. This was the unfounded belief that Japanese Americans living on the West Coast and in Hawaii had actively aided the Imperial Japanese Navy during the attack on Pearl Harbor. This specific lie had been the bedrock of the justification for Executive Order 9066, which led to the forced relocation and incarceration of over 120,000 people, two-thirds of whom were American citizens. By writing a character like Arthur Takamori, who tearfully confesses that his father was a traitorous signaler for the Japanese planes, the show was inadvertently validating the very propaganda that had destroyed the lives, businesses, and homes of thousands of innocent families. The irony is that Rod Serling was one of the most progressive voices in Hollywood. He spent his entire career fighting for the little guy and using his platform to dismantle prejudice. Yet, in this instance, the writing team tripped over their own desire for high-stakes drama. They wanted a shocking secret for Takamori that would parallel Fenton's war crime, but in doing so, they reached for a historical falsehood that was too painful to be used as entertainment. The JACL pointed out that there was never a single documented case of a Japanese American committing an act of espionage or sabotage during the Pearl Harbor attack. By presenting this traitor narrative as a tragic truth, the Twilight Zone was feeding a monster it usually tried to slay. The backlash was swift and fierce. Letters poured into CBS and the production offices. Viewers were horrified that a show known for its moral clarity would stumble so blindly into a racist trope. The network, sensing a PR nightmare that wouldn't go away, made the unprecedented decision to remove the episode from the syndication package. This meant that when the series went into reruns, becoming the staple of late-night TV and holiday marathons for the next half-century, the encounter was conspicuously missing. For decades, fans who owned episode guides would see the title and the credits, but they could never actually watch the footage. It became the holy grail for collectors, whispered about in fan circles but unseen by the masses. This erasure created a strange vacuum. Because people couldn't see the episode, the myth of its content grew. Some thought it was banned because of its extreme violence. Others heard rumors that the racial slurs used by Fenton were too graphic for broadcast standards. But the reality was much more nuanced. It was banned because it failed the very test Serling set for all his scripts. It failed to be truthful. It took a real-world community's trauma and distorted it for the sake of a plot twist. George Takei himself, who had been interned as a child, later reflected on the episode with mixed emotions. While he valued the work as an actor and the chance to play a complex lead role, the historical inaccuracy of the signaling traitor was a heavy burden for the story to carry. The ban lasted through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and into the new millennium. Even when the series was released on VHS and later DVD, the encounter was often the last piece of the puzzle to be included, sometimes relegated to bonus discs with heavy disclaimers. It wasn't until the cultural landscape had shifted significantly and the historical record regarding the internment had been more widely recognized and apologized for by the U.S. government that the episode was deemed safe to air again. When it finally made its return to cable television in 2016, it served as a stark time capsule. It showed a moment where even the most brilliant creators of the golden age of television could lose their way when trying to navigate the complexities of race and war. The erasure of The Encounter is a rare example of a ban that actually made sense from a social justice perspective. It wasn't about suppressing art. It was about acknowledging that the art had accidentally become a weapon against a marginalized group. The silence surrounding the episode for 50 years became a part of its legacy, turning it from a mere television script into a cautionary tale about the responsibility of the storyteller. It reminds us that in the zone, the things we choose to hide are often just as revealing as the things we choose to show. But was this attic the only place where the series ran into trouble with the censors? The missing archives. While The Encounter is the only episode that was scrubbed from the airwaves for half a century, it certainly wasn't the only time Rod Serling found himself in a bare-knuckle brawl with the censors. The missing archives of the Twilight Zone aren't just about deleted scenes. They are about the battles fought in the writer's room to keep the show's soul intact. Serling famously turned to science fiction precisely because he was tired of being told what he couldn't say. In the early 50s, when he wrote realistic teleplays about social issues, corporate sponsors would descend like vultures, picking apart any dialogue that might offend a potential customer. By moving his stories to the fifth dimension, Serling could talk about prejudice, war, and corruption by dressing them up as stories about Martians and Gremlin. But even with that mask, the friction was constant. One of the most famous examples of controversial content that almost didn't make it to air was the episode He's Alive, starring a young Dennis Hopper as a neo-Nazi struggling to find a following. The episode is a chilling look at how hate speech can find a foothold in desperate times. Throughout the filming, there were massive concerns about the depiction of the swastika and the inflammatory nature of the characters' speeches. Critics and sponsors were terrified that the episode would be seen as a recruitment tool rather than a warning. Serling, however, refused to back down. He argued that the only way to defeat a monster is to show it clearly for what it is. The episode aired, but it remains one of the most divisive and rarely rerun entries in the series because it strikes a nerve that is still raw today. Then there are the episodes that were banned in the sense of being heavily edited or suppressed in certain markets. Take The Little People, where an astronaut becomes a god to a race of microscopic beings. The episode deals with the corrupting nature of absolute power, but it faced significant pushback because of its cynical view of authority. Or The Shelter, an episode that turns a friendly neighborhood dinner party into a violent mob when a nuclear siren goes off. It was considered so bleak and so anti-American in its depiction of the suburban middle class that it caused a minor scandal. Sponsors hated it because it suggested that under the right pressure, good American neighbors would kill each other for a spot in a bunker. It didn't paint the rosy picture of the 60s nuclear family that the advertisers of laundry detergent and cigarettes wanted to project. There is also the curious case of The City of the Dead, a script that was never filmed because the themes of mass death and existential dread were deemed too much, even for the Twilight Zone. Serling often pushed the envelope until it tore. And while The Encounter is the only one that officially went into the vault, the series is littered with moments that were nearly lost to the cutting room floor. These controversial archives serve as a map of the era's anxieties, showing us exactly what the powers that be were afraid of. They were afraid of the mirror. They were afraid of the truth. But beyond the controversy and the cancelled labels, what was it about this show that made it a cultural titan? The Serling Doctrine. First, let's get to the man at the center of the storm. Rod Serling wasn't just a writer. He was a moral philosopher who happened to use a television as his pulpit. The Serling Doctrine was simple: use the fantastic to illuminate the mundane. He realized that if he tried to write a story about a black family moving into a white neighborhood in 1959, the network would kill it. But if he wrote a story about a purple alien moving into a green alien neighborhood, he could say everything he wanted to say about the civil rights movement without the censors even realizing what hit them. This Trojan horse method of storytelling is why the show became an instant classic. It operated on two levels. On the surface, it was a little disturbing anthology series that kept kids awake at night with twist endings and eerie music. But for the adults, it was a sophisticated critique of the Cold War, the Red Scare, and the dehumanizing effects of modern technology. The series arrived at a time when America was desperately trying to project an image of perfection. But Serling knew there were cracks in the foundation. He used the show to peer into those cracks. The success of the show was also due to its incredible production value. Serling recruited the best writers of the era, men like Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont, who brought a literary sensibility to the small screen. These weren't just TV writers, they were masters of the short story format. They understood that a good Twilight Zone episode was like a joke. It needed a perfect setup and a punchline, the twist, that recontextualized everything you had just seen. This twist became the show's signature, a narrative device so powerful that it has influenced every thriller and horror creator for the last 60 years. The fame of the series also comes from its relentless consistency. Even in its weaker fifth season, where The Encounter lives, the show was still attempting things that no other network program would dream of. It was an intellectual playground. Whether it was Burgess Meredith breaking his glasses in a world where he finally had time to read, or William Shatner seeing a creature on the wing of a plane, the show created icons. These weren't just characters. They were archetypes of the human condition. The series became a shared language for the American public, a way to discuss their deepest fears in a safe, fictional space. Echoes from the Fifth Dimension. While Rod Serling provided the voice and the moral compass for the Twilight Zone, it was the faces of the anthology's rotating cast that anchored its surrealism in reality. Serling's scripts required a specific kind of performer, one who could convey absolute terror or existential heartbreak within a lean, 25-minute window. Many of these actors were established veterans of the stage, while others were fresh-faced youngsters who would go on to define Hollywood for the next half-century. To understand the show's impact, one must look at the actors who navigated its parables and see where the zone took them once the cameras stopped rolling. If any two actors could be called the faces of the series, they are Burgess Meredith and Jack Klugman. Neither was a traditional leading man. They were character actors whose relatability made their descent into the uncanny all the more jarring. Burgess Meredith appeared in 4 episodes, most famously as the nearsighted Henry Bemis in Time Enough at Last. His portrayal of a man whose only wish, to be left alone to read, is granted by a nuclear apocalypse remains the series' most poignant tragedy. Following his tenure in the zone, Meredith's career experienced a massive second and third act. He became a camp icon as the Penguin in the 60s Batman series and later earned Academy Award nominations for his role as the grizzled trainer Mickey Goldmill in the Rocky films. He remained a mainstay of American cinema until his passing in 1997 at the age of 89. Jack Klugman matched Meredith with 4 appearances, often playing gritty, sweat-stained men grappling with fate. Whether he was a down-on-his-luck trumpet player in A Passage for Trumpet or a pool shark in A Game of Pool, Klugman brought a visceral, nervous energy to the screen. After the show, Klugman transitioned into one of the most successful television careers in history, starring as Oscar Madison in The Odd Couple and later as the titular coroner in Quincy, M.E. Even after losing a vocal cord to cancer in the 80s, Klugman returned to the stage, proving as resilient as the characters he played for Serling. He passed away in 2012 at the age of 90. For many, the Twilight Zone served as a high-profile laboratory where future legends tested their mettle. William Shatner provided one of the series' most enduring images in Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. As Bob Wilson, a man recovering from a nervous breakdown who sees a gremlin on the wing of a plane, Shatner delivered a masterclass in controlled hysteria. Just 3 years after this episode aired, Shatner was cast as Captain James T. Kirk in Star Trek, a role that would define him for eternity. Today, Shatner is a cultural phenomenon. At 95, he has actually traveled to space via Blue Origin, turning his sci-fi fiction into reality. A strikingly young, blonde Robert Redford appeared in Nothing in the Dark as Mr. Death. Playing the Grim Reaper as a kind, wounded soldier, Redford displayed the quiet charisma that would soon make him the biggest movie star in the world. Redford's post-Zone life is the stuff of Hollywood legend, spanning classics like Butch Cassidy and The Sundance Kid to his founding of the Sundance Institute, which revolutionized independent filmmaking. Though largely retired from acting today, he remains a titan of the industry. Burt Reynolds also made a memorable, if satirical, appearance in The Bard. He played an actor named Rocky Rhodes, delivering a biting parody of Marlon Brando's method acting style. Reynolds would later become the quintessential 70s leading man in hits like Smokey and the Bandit and Deliverance. Before his death in 2018, he enjoyed a significant critical comeback with Boogie Night, proving that the comedic timing he displayed in The Zone had only sharpened with age. The Zone often asked its actors to carry episodes with very little support, sometimes even without dialogue. Agnes Moorehead, already a respected member of Orson Welles' Mercury Theatre, delivered a tour de force in The Invaders. Playing a rustic woman battling tiny aliens, Moorehead did not speak a single word of dialogue, relying entirely on grunts, gasps, and physical movement. She went on to become a household name as Endora on Bewitched. Her death in 1974 marked the end of an era for classically trained actors who could dominate the screen through sheer presence. On the younger end of the spectrum was Billy Mumy, who played the terrifying, godlike child Anthony Fremont in It's a Good Life. Mumy's ability to project cold, infantile malice made him a standout. He parlayed this success into a starring role in Lost in Space as Will Robinson, and later became a staple of the sci-fi community in Babylon 5. Today, Mumy is a prolific musician and writer, frequently appearing at conventions to discuss his time spent wishing people into the cornfield. The tragedy of an anthology series filmed over 60 years ago is that much of its cast has since passed into the great unknown. Legends like Lee Marvin, The Grave, Charles Bronson, too, and Elizabeth Montgomery, too, used the show as a stepping stone to massive careers before their eventual passing. However, their performances remain frozen in high contrast black and white, as vibrant today as they were in 1959. The actors of The Twilight Zone were unique because they were not playing recurring heroes. They were playing us. They were the fearful, the greedy, the lonely, and the hopeful. When we see a young Dennis Hopper playing a neo-Nazi in He's Alive, or George Takei in The Encounter, we are seeing the raw DNA of Hollywood history. Today, the few remaining cast members, Shatner, Mummy, and Veronica Cartwright, the child star of I Sing the Body Electric, serve as the final ambassadors of Serling's vision. They are the survivors of a golden age of television storytelling, reminding us that while the actors eventually leave the stage, the stories they told in the zone are timeless. Beyond Shadows. When you watch Black Mirror, you are watching the Serling doctrine applied to the digital age. When you watch a Jordan Peele film, who eventually hosted a reboot of the series, you are seeing the direct DNA of The Encounter, the use of horror to explore the jagged edges of race and social identity. The show taught us that the most effective way to talk about the world is to step slightly outside of it. The fame of the series has only grown in the era of streaming. Unlike other shows of its time, which feel like museum pieces, The Twilight Zone feels strangely contemporary. Its themes, paranoia about our neighbors, the fear of losing our humanity to machines, the danger of mob mentality are more relevant today than they were in 1960. We are living in a time where The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street happens every day on social media. Serling's voice, which always sounded like it was coming from a place of deep concern and tired wisdom, still resonates because he was writing about the human heart in conflict with itself, which is the only thing worth writing about. The reason we still talk about the cancelled episode, the controversial scenes, and the genius of the plot is that the show remains a challenge. It challenges us to look at our own attics, to confront our own samurai swords, and to ask ourselves what secrets we are burying. It proved that television could be art, that science fiction could be serious, and that even a simple story about two men in an attic could shake the foundations of a network for 50 years. As long as there is a middle ground between light and shadow, there will be a place for the Twilight Zone. For more deep dives in this channel, hit subscribe and that notification bell to get notified.